In 2014, indie developer Red Hook Studios began full development on Darkest Dungeon after a successful Kickstarter campaign. From its very beginning, Darkest Dungeon positioned itself very clearly as a Lovecraftian, rogue-like dungeon crawler with some resource management elements. That meant it promised tactical and strategic complexity, brutal difficulty, unpredictable, procedurally generated levels and enemies, and tough decisions with no clear best choice. As the game reminds you in its intro cinematic sequence, Darkest Dungeon is about making the best of a bad situation, and the game doesn't hesitate to put you in those bad situations. Characters die permanently, get sick, resist your commands, and there are never enough resources to adequately equip and heal the characters that make it out of a dungeon run. Success in Darkest Dungeon is more about barely scraping by with a battered and terrified party of naive adventurers than about accumulating piles of gold with a fully powered, nearly invincible team. At this point, some of you might be wondering, how in the world could something like that be fun? Why would anyone want to play a game like that? And after roughly 80 hours of playtime, I found myself asking that same question. What was drawing me to this game? And more broadly, what had drawn so many other players to it? As of May 2017, the game has sold over 1 million copies on Steam, a massive success for an independent developer. So what about the game resonated with such a large audience, and why now? I'd like to argue here that a significant part of Darkest Dungeon's appeal is the way that it uses its particular brand of horror to play on anxieties about working and living in the 21st century.
Precision and power.
But first, a bit more detail about the game. As mentioned before, Darkest Dungeon is aesthetically inspired by the Lovecraft style of horror. This style of horror relies less on jump scares and visceral graphic violence, and more on a broader sense of existential horror and dread. Darkest Dungeon operates in this genre insofar as it plays with these concepts of madness, the unnatural, the unknowable, the unholy, and powerlessness, and this manifests in both the game's aesthetics and its gameplay. The gameplay is split into two distinct parts: a tactical combat dungeon crawler and a strategic resource management simulator. Essentially, the player forms a team of 4 adventurers, goes on a procedurally generated dungeon run, and attempts to defeat enemies, collect resources, and complete the run's mission. Resources gathered in each dungeon run are then spent in the hamlet that the player manages and expands. There are various facilities in the hamlet that the player can use to upgrade, train, and heal his adventurers to prepare them for the next dungeon run. What I really appreciate about Darkest Dungeon is that this feedback loop between collecting resources in dungeon runs and spending them in my hamlet was not only enjoyable, but also gave a sense of narrative progression between dungeon runs. Besides the simple accumulation of resources, the game binds these tactical and strategic parts together with a mechanic that the developers call the affliction system. In dungeon runs, adventurers suffer not only damage to health in combat, but also damage to their sanity, which is represented by their stress meter. If their stress meter increases beyond a certain point, their resolve is tested, and the adventurer will likely take on a permanent negative quirk and become unpredictable and sometimes uncontrollable. This stress persists between dungeon runs, and the only way to relieve an adventurer's stress is to have them visit the tavern or the abbey in your hamlet. These stress-relieving facilities can cost a lot of gold, and they take the character out of operation for a week, the unit of time designated for a dungeon run, meaning that your de-stressing adventurer will not be available for your following run. To complicate matters, only a few characters can use each of the services provided by the tavern or abbey, meaning that, especially in the beginning stages of the game, the player is forced to neglect some adventurers and leave their stress levels high. In the early stages of my first playthrough of the game, I found managing the stress levels of my adventurers to be the most challenging aspect of the gameplay. After a little while, I was starting to realize that the more difficult dungeon runs were not only going to regularly kill my adventurers, but they were also going to stress my surviving adventurers so much that I wouldn't be able to treat them all. Frustrated, I turned to the internet for advice. After some searching, I came across a beginner's guide on the Steam forums from a user named Euronymous Alloy that not only helped me move forward in the game, but also totally changed my thinking about the game. In a section entitled Initial Development, Alloy gave the following advice. Number 1, your troops are disposable. The first mental hump to get over. This is not like other games. Your adventurers are going to die, and they are going to go insane. Do not get attached to them. They are poor, disposable chumps who you've suckered to your estate with promises of wealth and dreams of glory. Your job as an adventurer coach is not to keep all your adventurers happy and sane and healthy or even alive. Your job is to maintain and build effective adventuring teams. That means protecting and nurturing your best players and ruthlessly cutting and firing your bad players. In 2 short paragraphs, Alloy cut straight to the source of my struggles, which was not party composition or bad tactical decisions in battle, but rather my attitude towards my adventurers. After years of playing games in which I'd basically been trained to identify with my avatar in the game world, I was completely blind to the idea that my attachment to my adventurers was holding me back. At the same time, Darkest Dungeon is kind of coy about this fact. The game gives the player the option of renaming adventures and changing their appearance, an option which suggests your adventures will last long enough for those changes to matter. But the unpredictability of combat quickly dispels any notion of fostering a team of your favorite heroes and proves Alloy's point. As a player, you cannot get invested in your adventurers because there is no way to guarantee that they will last very long. Having realized this kind of awful truth about the game, I got frustrated in a different way. Why would the game even let me start connecting with characters if I was supposed to treat them as disposable? It seemed downright cruel. But as I've thought about this, I've become convinced that this cruel act is actually an important design choice that solves a difficult and unique problem that horror games, specifically, have to deal with. When we think about how games function, they run into a problem with certain kinds of horror genres. All games, regardless of how complex or simple, have rules that govern play. As players play the game, they learn those rules and get better at operating within the constraints that those rules impose, and start to acquire different levels of mastery. While this feeling of mastery and control is satisfying and an important part of many games, it's kind of problematic for games that aspire to produce the feeling of powerlessness and helplessness that's so important to Lovecraftian horror. I would argue that Red Hook combated this natural tendency towards mastery in games by introducing gameplay elements that reduce the player's control over the fate of their adventurers. But there's another problem that this randomness introduces. What if a player has several bad runs in a row, spending every last gold piece on preparation items and returning from those runs empty-handed and without adventurers? Darkest Dungeon answers this problem with a very simple solution. A continuous supply of new adventurers every week, ready to be recruited to the player's roster for free. When I realized the importance of the fact that labor is a free resource in Darkest Dungeon, the game took on a whole different tone of horror to me, which, as the title of the video suggests, I call the horror of capital. Darkest Dungeon not only demonstrates, but also relies upon the fact that a closed system of resource circulation cannot produce additional value, and solves that problem by providing an endless source of free labor in the form of fresh, new adventurers. As these new adventurers are made available, the player is subtly encouraged to identify with them and to invest, both in an economic and an emotional sense, in those adventurers. But the player quickly learns that if he doesn't exploit his workers as efficiently as possible, if he doesn't simply dismiss his stressed out, diseased adventurers after they've gone on a successful dungeon run for him, then he will not advance in the game. And it's through this alienation and detachment that Darkest Dungeon creates its horror, no matter how skilled the player becomes. So where does this leave us in terms of our original question? Why did this game about the horrors of exploited, alienated labor find such a wide and ready audience over the course of its development? Obviously, there are many reasons why, but I don't think we should overlook the way that Darkest Dungeon symbolically speaks to the very real economic conditions of the 21st century labor market. Automation, the easy flow of capital and products across the globe, and the uncertain future of social welfare programs have created a dire situation for workers seeking jobs. Meanwhile, older workers live in fear of being replaced by younger, cheaper workers. And Darkest Dungeon shows the player how, from the perspective of the manager, it's almost always cheaper to cut someone loose when their ailments become expensive. I imagine most Republican lawmakers would approve of this important lesson that Darkest Dungeon teaches us. But seriously, Darkest Dungeon's horrifying gameplay and aesthetics manage to capture the precarity of the worker in all its brutal reality. Even the player's position as a sort of middle manager in the Darkest Dungeon offers no comforts. Though she may not risk her life, she's never free to prioritize the well-being of her workers over profit when operating in a fiercely competitive space where labor is plentiful. Resources simply won't allow it, and she won't make progress if she doesn't embrace an attitude of ruthless efficiency. Perhaps it serves as a mere pleasant distraction from the horrors of everyday life, but for me, there's something about Darkest Dungeon's refusal to resolve the horror of capital that opens up a space for critique and reflection. After that, it's up to us to decide whether or not we want to live in the world of the Darkest Dungeon.